Hi, I'm Julian Moses. This is going to be my new weekly wind-up. I've been trying over the last few months to get myself into a writing habit weekly. Started off with a newsletter about agriculture, and then I realized that I spend a lot of time thinking about more than agriculture. And I'd like to have something that I can put together every week and really get summarize what I'm looking at every week, and I think it's just interesting for other people to follow along with, or I hope it is. So my goal is to find a few things, or to share a few things that I've read and that I've learned over every week, and I'm planning on doing this until the end of July to start, just as a test phase to see if it works. So let's jump right in. This week I've been reading this book called Titan by who's it by? This is it. It's by Ron Chernoff. It's about the life of John D. Rockefeller. Right now, at this phase in the book that I'm in, he's in the process of building up this monopoly that is Standard Oil. John D. Rockefeller is a guy who built up the world's probably largest company ever in the late 1800s, based on the oil or in the oil business, and his the basically all the monopoly laws that have been passed in the United States were based on what he and his kind of cronies had done. One of the interesting quotes that I'd found in my reading this week was just the way he thought about speaking to newspapers. So, what could we say, he asked rhetorically, without telling the world just how we were making our success? So, that goes in combination with the corruption, with him paying off politicians, with him doing all these things that are probably morally questionable at best, and really kind of taking it to the next level and pushing these things a little bit further than going on. He was he had a man of faith, but for some reason he had this whole thing in his head that it was his divine goal to basically do whatever he could to achieve as much wealth as possible so he could give it away, and he was willing to break all moral codes in between getting to where he wanted to go and where he was. So I just found it extremely interesting how he thought the ends always justified the means, and that kind of focus. It's to me there are things that he did that were morally reprehensible, and it's interesting how he was able to justify that in his own mind. The next thing that I read this week that was really interesting was Lena Khan's "We Must Regulate AI Now." Lena Khan is the chair of the Federal Trade Commission, and she's a strong voice for the regulation of technology companies. She's spoken about this with regards to Facebook, Google, all these big companies that act as monopolies often, particularly in the advertising space. In the essay, she doesn't actually speak about how she would want to regulate, but just why it's important to regulate. So a little bit of a disconnect between title and content. Um, Again, this is just something I found to be interesting. A few of the big companies that she talks about are Microsoft, Google, Facebook, and they have this power over AI because they control data and they control compute resources. For AI to work, you do need those two things. You need a lot of data and a lot of compute resources to basically create these large language models that are really almost just similar to lookup tables, but that's a different conversation. One of the other things that she talked about is that fraud will become more widespread. So basically, what people can do is they can set up customized fraud agents. So if I look at someone's Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, or whatever, I can see what interests them, and then I can write some software that will customize a pitch to them and get them to buy whatever I'm selling. You can do that en masse for the first time ever. So this is a really interesting kind of like scary use case of artificial intelligence that people don't necessarily talk about all the time, but will become more widespread. So it's just something to watch out for as you're kind of interacting on the internet, is that a lot of things could become internet fraud very quickly. And then her last argument, which I personally found the weakest, is that much of the data is unchecked, meaning that there's misinformation and bias within it. First of all, there's bias in all data. Data is naturally biased because that's a different conversation again, but it's an interesting perspective to think that that's the reason that you should regulate artificial intelligence. And then she also didn't really talk about the massive risks to humanity, which I think are a more compelling argument in the end anyways. Um, I think it's an interesting read. She doesn't necessarily fulfill her promise at the beginning, which is telling us how she would regulate it, because I think this is such a hard, large, wide-spreading issue that it's difficult to pin that down into a small op-ed in the New York Times. But I do think it's interesting to read her perspective that it does need to be regulated and that this is probably the way things are going to go. A lot of the big tech leaders kind of went into the White House and had a conversation with Joe Biden, and now they have Kamala Harris as AI czar or something like this, I think. And so it's interesting to see that there is going to be some sort of regulatory approach to it, as well as government investment in that kind of stuff. Next is the case for big action to regulate artificial intelligence. That was kind of the theme of what I read this week, is regulation in artificial intelligence. Chamath Palihapitiya wrote this article. He's the Silicon Valley guy. He started the growth teams at Facebook, which is kind of how it became such a massive platform. And now he's some big hotshot investor guy. Now, it's really interesting to see what he thinks about AI regulation, because he is one of these Silicon Valley guys, but also tends to go a little bit differently than others in Silicon Valley. So he's in the same vein, but has different opinions, which I think is an interesting way to see things. At first, my instinct would have been that he's not someone who would have been for a lot of AI regulations, but after reading the first two paragraphs of this essay, it's completely the opposite. So he starts off like this: in technology circles, people balk at the mere mention of government regulation. The naysayers argue it interferes with innovation and is a bad byproduct of big government. But history tells a different story. Transparent, accountable, and expert oversight, even when implemented late or ineffectively at first, has proven to be an important part of scaling an economy. Basically, the arguments that he makes, he gives a point and a counterpoint to each argument. So the point is someone against AI regulation. The counterpoint is his argument against that. So his first thing is that we can figure it out as it goes along, and he basically is saying that AI is moving too fast to do that. We are looking for updates in AI every week, as opposed to every year or every few months. So the exponential curve, which you all learned about from COVID, is more like this than kind of drawn out and longer. I think it's a really interesting argument. And as someone who's consistently working with these systems and playing around with them all the time in my spare time, I can attest to this. It's moving really, really fast. So his next argument is that we have a ton of well-regulated industries. The FAA regulates airline travel. And the FDA regulates food and drugs. And the counterpoint is that you can't rely on business to regulate itself. So his point, which I found to be extremely entertaining and kind of illuminating, was, what if big tobacco regulated big tobacco? Everyone would be smoking. We'd see advertisements everywhere for tobacco. But I found this to be a really good argument. And one way that this is already played out in the technology ecosystem is with GDPR and CCPA, is the California one. So GDPR basically is a privacy framework that doesn't allow data to be sold without the consent of the data owner, which is theoretically the person who is the user of an application. So this is a successful work of legislation, which, even though it was implemented late and inefficiently, still made an impact on the way our data is processed. And then basically his whole argument is that this is happening so fast that we need to have some sort of regulation so we can even think about the consequences that are coming from this kind of stuff. I think this was, I've been trying to take in more of this opinion because I think it's an interesting one, and I think it's one that is the reality of the matter, is that AI is moving really quickly, and we probably don't need to be moving this quickly. And so I've been really trying to listen to this a little bit more, and that's why there are two articles in this. Finally is The Rewards of Rivalry, which is a foreign affairs article, which basically talks about the real winner in the conflict between China and the U.S. is going to be the climate, which makes me very happy. But of course, conflict is always bad. But this article is basically saying that historically, during times of great power competition, existential threats get more attention. So one example that they used is nuclear weapons after World War II, with the founding of the IAEA and nuclear non-proliferation treaties that happened a little bit later on. We see that when powers are facing an existential threat where something can go wrong for everyone, they pay attention a little bit more and they try and do what's right for their group of people. An interesting excerpt from the article. In the long run, however, competition over green technologies might prove as beneficial as cooperative diplomacy, perhaps even more so. For instance, European countries, the United States, and others have been alarmed at the Chinese dominance of the supply chain for minerals such as copper, lithium, and other commodities that are essential for producing clean energy. As these governments belatedly act to shore up their supply chains, they are facilitating mining investments worldwide that could lower the cost of decarbonization for everyone. Basically, what this is saying is that we have a lot of battery metals that are in the earth, and unfortunately, we have to excavate them to meet our energy demands, which are consistently growing. And we don't. The argument to be made is that our energy demands shouldn't be growing, and that's actually the core problem. But if we wanted to keep energy growing at the same track that it is, we need to have more battery metals, because the biggest issue with electricity is that it's hard to store. And here, basically, this is saying that because of this, we're going to find more innovation, more advancements in these hard industrial problems because of the fact that there's competition between these large entities. Finally, they talk a little bit about the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a bill passed by President Joe Biden in 2022 that basically just serves as an economic investment bill that is heavily focused on the energy sector. So there's a lot of investment in solar, a lot of investment in battery metals and research and these kinds of things. China has openly stated that they want to become a world leader in clean energy. So there are a lot of things that are going better for the climate because of these conflicts. Business as usual obviously is not going to work in terms of this situation. And then kind of what I learned over the last week, or 2 weeks rather, because there's something interesting that I did. So 2 weeks ago, my friend and I, we took off on a trip to go to Italy, and not to go vacation, but to go work. When I say work, I mean we filmed a documentary, which is probably going to end up being 5 parts. This documentary will be focused on the Italian Volleyball Championships, or the Scudetto. We got to go to 2 finals matches and the 3rd place match. We got to watch 4 of the best teams in the world go play volleyball, which is an absolute treat for me as a former volleyball player. What was interesting was that we got to see, I personally got to learn how important a first impression is. We made a bad first impression on someone. We showed up late or missed an interview because we had rental car issues, and I did a bad job communicating that. I think understanding that first impression affected us later down the road was an important lesson for me to kind of take and re-put back into my mind, because we hear this all the time, but it's not clear. It's not the easiest thing to digest. The next, we had this expression, closed mouths don't get fed. The entire time we were there, we had to ask for things, and we had no idea what was going on. We had to ask for help, ask for more resources, ask for an interview with a player, ask for an interview with a president, ask for an interview with a coach, ask for whatever we could get our hands on to put this thing together. And we had to ask for a lot of absurd things that I was very uncomfortable requesting. But the more absurd they were, the more people would try and be helpful and try and reach some sort of olive branch out to make things work. So if it was, hey, we would like to speak to 1 or 2 of your players before the match, it's like, hey, you can't do it before the match, but maybe we can put something together for the next day. So then that's how we got one of the best players in the world, the best volleyball players in the world, to have an interview with us. And that was really interesting. I was really excited to kind of get that. And then I began freelancing again recently. So I found a bunch of project work essentially. And we have this project that we put together for a little bit, and then it wasn't working the way it should have, and that was partially my fault on the development side, but also just a lot of chaos that went on. So what I learned was that you have to keep trying, and you have to look for alternate situations or solutions. So we tried doing it one methodology, and then as soon as we went to another methodology, we got better results faster, and then did that. As the clients used it, they got back to us, and this is all in a matter of the last 2 or 3 days. So as they used it, they got back to us and they told us this is the problem, and then it was immediately, hey, how do we fix it? And the more flexible I was and the more I tried things, the better results I got. So then the last one, which is kind of the cheat code that I use for the keep trying, is use ChatGPT for everything that you can. I've set it as my homepage. For programming stuff, it's the most helpful thing I can do. I've turned from an average developer into someone who can put a really complicated project together really quickly. I don't even develop professionally, and I've become a good software developer through this tool. It's been an amazing kind of thing to have, and I feel like I'm learning a lot. I'm trying to build other skills outside of that, because the kids that are learning how to develop software with this as a teacher are going to be so much better than I can be. So I'm trying to develop other skills around this, which is part of what this is. Anyways, this is what the last week has been. Please let me know if you have any feedback or anything. Would love to take it. And thank you for your time.